Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast and to the continuation of our conversation on the artist Perugino, that famous painter who trained in Florence and established a very successful workshop in Perugia, in central Italy, in the region of Umbria. We should recall two very important details to set us up for the conversation today. First is that when we looked at Perugino's mature style, what we saw was his workshop output appears to be somewhat stiff, with highly reduced emotion and movement. Those elements are the crux of his style. Second is that Perugino was probably the master of Raphael, and today we are going to look at two works of art of the exact same subject so that we can understand the how and the why of Raphael's rise to Renaissance stardom via Perugino. This is truly a textbook comparison where we can look at two relatively famous artworks between master and apprentice to understand developments and stylistic shifts. Now, Raphael was raised in the court of Urbino, which is one of the major Renaissance centers in central Italy. He was born in 1483, so he's a small child during the Florentine Golden Age of the 1480s. His father's name was Giovanni Santi, and Giovanni was an author and a painter for the Montefeltro court in Urbino, which means that Raphael was exposed to all of the intricacies of high court culture from a very young age, which likely contributed to his success in this artist patron relationship, unlike the more antagonistic types of artists like Michelangelo. There is a bit of a question mark on exactly what the master to pupil relationship was with Perugino. We always have Giorgio Vasari to go to, who, of course, is not 100% reliable, but is the main source telling us that Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father, placed Raphael in Perugino's workshop when Raphael was a young boy. I'm going to read the passage for you from Vasari on this episode from the Life of Raphael, which shows Vasari priming us to eventually see Raphael surpass his master. So Vasari, in his Life of Raphael, says, quote, "And thus Pietro," that is Pietro Perugino, "and thus Pietro, who was very gracious and an admirer of fine talents, accepted Raphael, whereupon Giovanni joyfully returned to Urbino, and, taking the young lad, despite many tears from the boy's mother who loved him tenderly, he brought him to Perugia, where Pietro, seeing Raphael's style of drawing and his beautiful manners and moral habits, formed a judgment about him which time and his works later proved to be perfectly accurate. It is remarkable that while Raphael studied Pietro's style, he imitated it so exactly in all its details that his portraits could not be distinguished from his master's originals." End quote. So we have this magnificent pupil in Perugia working under the great master Perugino, and you cannot tell their work apart, even from a young age, according to Vasari. The two paintings we're going to be discussing are dated to around the same time. Perugino's is from between 1500 and 1504, and Raphael's is signed and dated 1504. During the time we would consider him already a master, although a very young one. I also want to point out that Perugino outlives Raphael. Unfortunately, Raphael died suddenly in 1520, and he was only 37 years old, and Perugino died in 1523 in his late 70s. So that's where we are with their lifespans. So the paintings in question are the Marriage of the Virgin. Let's hammer out the story first of the marriage of the Virgin, then have a look at how Perugino and Raphael each respectively depicted this scene. The story of the marriage of the Virgin Mary comes primarily from early Christian tradition, especially what are known as apocryphal texts outside of the Bible that are not always necessarily canon, such as the Proto-Evangelium of James, that is the Gospel of James, which is claimed to be written by Jesus Christ's brother, James, but it's really a text from approximately the 2nd century. According to this account, Mary was raised in the Temple of Jerusalem from a very young age, dedicated to God by her parents. As she reached maturity, the priest sought a suitable guardian for her since she had taken a vow of virginity. To determine who should marry Mary, the high priest gathers widowers, all from the house of David, that Old Testament King David, David the giant slayer David, since Christ's lineage must trace back to King David. And he instructed each of these to bring with them a rod. So, according to the story, the miraculous sign would reveal God's choice of who will be the husband of the Virgin Mary. When the suitors arrived with their rods, it was Joseph's rod that blossomed into a flower, signaling his divine favor. So, though Joseph was older and initially reluctant, feeling unworthy, he accepted the role in obedience to God's will. The union of Joseph and Mary is often understood not as a standard marriage, but as a chaste and a protective guardianship. So Joseph becomes Mary's protector and the legal father of Jesus, ensuring her safety and social standing within their community. The marriage thus plays a crucial role in the broader narrative of the incarnation, providing a stable and honorable context for the birth of Christ within the history of the so called Near East. Okay, I hope all of that makes sense. So, this subject is of extreme importance to the Renaissance art world of Perugia itself. Why is that, you ask me? In 1473, the Santo Anello, or the Holy Ring is called, was brought to Perugia from the nearby town of Chiusi and is housed in the Cathedral of San Lorenzo in Perugia. The chapel of St. Joseph in San Lorenzo was rededicated to the chapel of the Holy Ring, which this ring, you probably guessed it, is traditionally considered to be the very ring that Joseph gave to Mary for their wedding in the story that I just recounted to you. So this ring today remains one of the most important relics in Perugia. In the Renaissance context, the acquisition of this relic would have been seen as an important moment in the further legitimization of Perugia's presence in Italy as a religious power. And so, in commissioning Perugino create an altarpiece for this newly renamed chapel, we should see it not as a new story and not as a new art subject, but as one that expresses the importance of a very recent history for Renaissance Perugia, even though it's an old story. The acquisition of the Holy Ring, of the Santo Anello, and the dedication of a chapel to it. And in order to signal the prestige of the chapel in this new relic, Perugino reuses many compositional elements from his work in the Sistine Chapel, Christ giving the keys to St. Peter, which he completed for Pope Sixtus IV in the early 1480s. So there's a lot of layers, of contemporary layers, to Perugino's Marriage of the Virgin. And then the theme of commissioning a work to venerate the Holy Ring is then picked up by the nearby town of Città del Castello in the province of Perugia for the Church of San Francesco, upon which Raphael completes the painting with a very heavy influence from Perugino's own work in Perugia, which would be their local cathedral. in both paintings, Raphael and Perugino's Marriage of the Virgin, that is what you're going to look at if you want to have a look as I talk about this. We have several elements from the story. The temple in the background is not one of any true ancient origin, but it's rather a form of Renaissance ideal architecture with a twist. We'll get to it. We have a piazza that shows a detailed and masterful use of linear perspective. Interestingly, it could be suggested that Perugino had some knowledge of his contemporary Jerusalem, which, on the site of the former Temple of Jerusalem, is the now Islamic shrine called the Dome of the Rock, which is part of the Al Aqsa Mosque complex in Jerusalem. I said now Islamic because it's not the Jewish temple. It was always an Islamic shrine that was built in the 7th century by the Umayyad Caliphate, where it was later embellished by the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of the tile and ceramics are Ottoman. And the Dome of the Rock was known well in Europe in Perugino's time. We're talking an octagonal structure with a dome on top. No, Perugino's structure looks more Renaissance than Umayyad or Ottoman, but one has to wonder if this is the idea behind the architectural choices he makes to evoke a real known Jerusalem where in some accounts the marriage took place, right? Octagonal structure with a dome. That's as basic as it gets. The Dome of the Rock structure does not look like Perugino's temple, but it evokes it. It recalls very specific architectural elements of it. It's just a hypothesis. Joseph and Mary are in the center of both compositions, being married by the high priest. The ring being placed on Mary's finger in both compositions, signaling the ring that is the holy relic of Perugia. The suitors, all from the line of David, who came with their rods, are shown, and many of them, there's mixed emotions. There's a little bit of relief, there's a little bit of frustration, and you see the frustrated suitors are breaking their rods. Okay, they're not appearing terribly happy that Joseph was the suitor who emerged as the victor of this divine competition. The narrative premise and details are all rather consistent across the two artworks. However, we see between the two some major advances in composition when Raphael takes over the subject. Right off the bat, we have it in the figures and in the grouping of the figures. Not to mention, in Perugino's, there's this very odd scene in the back left with a suitor who is frustrated, breaking the rod over his knee, and there's an idealized nude figure that looks just like the Apollo figure that we saw in the last podcast. But the figures are very Peruginesque in his. They're very stiff. The movement is there, but it's not particularly effective. And all of the figures are sort of crushed. The main figures are crushed into the forward plane. So there is a sense of plane, but that plane has all of these figures on a horizontal spread versus Raphael's, who introduces more movement and more dynamism and more depth on the front plane with his figures in the way that he's grouped them. Notice in Perugino's, the left figure who is bending the rod over their thigh has a lot less dynamic composition than in Raphael's, who has a figure leaning back and bending a knee to snap the rod in the full foreground. And notice how Joseph's feet in Perugino's are on a level ground versus on Raphael's, they form a kind of an R shape, like a lowercase R shape, that shows one foot receded in space. Notice the way the rods are being bent and the way that Mary's hand is raised and to receive the ring as Joseph steps forward to put it on, and even something as minimal as the high priest in Perugino's work is standing straight up top to bottom, versus in Raphael, he slightly twists his torso and bends in to watch, his hands on each of their wrists, helping Joseph put the ring on Mary's hand, looking on with interest. And how Raphael groups these figures is quite exceptional. Additionally, if we were to look at the modeling of the figures in the way that the color system works, we see a more prominent use of brighter highlights in Raphael and darker darks. That is your chiaroscuro. That means Raphael is creating a higher sense of volume and space in his colors and in his figures. And we can see there's a remarkable change in the architecture. While I said very clearly that perhaps we are talking about an octagonal structure from Perugino, Raphael greatly expands on the number of sides of the building, so maybe he doesn't have the Al-Aqsa complex in mind or the Dome of the Rock, or he's just looking at what Perugino is doing and is expanding upon it. It's because you see, you can count one, two, three sides facing us from Perugino. Plus, you would have the two sides with those porticos, plus an additional three, making 8, an octagonal base. But Raphael gives us, if you count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dynamic sides facing us, from which his perspectival grid radiates outward and onto a more embellished decorative type of architecture that has these enormous swirling buttresses against the dome, that has, look at this, look how amazing, groin vaults and barrel vaulting, upon which these Roman-style arches are all converging and creating a series of vaults that we are able to see in Raphael's extraordinarily dynamic architecture, and upon which he reduces the size of the door that lets us see through the temple and creates a round drum. I suppose we can call it a drum, really showing his his masterful perspectival use of architecture, whereas Perugino went for a much less complex, much more reserved type of architecture. Very clearly, Raphael looked at his masters and said, "We can do better than that." So not only does Raphael expand on the architecture, but he improves the space between the architecture and the marriage taking place in front of the temple by the way he does the proportions of his figures and the groupings that creates a more balanced, harmonized space. And he is sure not to cut off the actual dome, so he can show you, not only am I going to create perspectival grid with this dynamic architecture, I'm going to do it with both angular and rounded spaces. And I'm going to pair the groupings better. And I am going to do the scale of the figures in a more accurate way so that the space recedes in a more believable manner. Everything that Raphael does, even though he has taken the composition from his master, he has taken the 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 entire concept of how to interpret the marriage of the Virgin from his master, he has simply enhanced almost every single design element to create an overall more successful work of art. And what this does, by creating this kind of spatial enhancement, no longer are you in Perugino's world. In Perugino's world, because of the way he renders space, you are looking at a scene, right, from the Bible or from an apocryphal source. You are observing at a distance a scene that is being presented to you, versus Raphael, who opens up the space so that you are a spectator at the scene. You are there. You are bearing witness. The space encapsulates you. You are not outside of the space looking at it. You are in the space experiencing it. That is the radical difference between Raphael and Perugino's artworks, these two in particular. Ultimately, Raphael is clearly inspired by Perugino, but he manages to improve the harmony of the space by making improvements to the composition, be it the architectural rendering or the grouping of the figures, or how those groupings create a better sense of multiple planes within the artwork. As we will see in the upcoming episodes, Raphael would grow his talents far beyond simply improving upon Perugino's compositions and style. Right after the completion of this artwork in 1504, Raphael would make a long term journey to train and learn in Florence, where his early style will merge with the developments in painting that were in Florence at the height of their expressive power at this point, the turn of the century from the 1400s to the 1500s. Only then would Raphael get called to Rome, elevated to the highest tier of patronage to paint for the Pope in the Vatican Palace, his very famous Stanza della Segnatura, or the Vatican Stanze, because he does multiple rooms, not just the Segnatura, which is the conversation for down the line when we get to the Vatican. Renaissance people, this closes the book on Perugino, who is undoubtedly among the most important artists of central Italy. Although Perugino's style is more solid and does not really push boundaries, it lays the groundwork for Raphael's expressive power, a force that will change the entire visual vocabulary of Renaissance Rome. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion of Perugino and Raphael, and I thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, Renaissance people, arrivederci.